What's up, sluts? It's Coffee and Kabbalah and Coffee. It's 5th of ER 5786, Wednesday, April 22nd. No one really knows for sure. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. With the door we lie. Started. 37 31:30 Seth, son of Adam, was born. 35:26 2:30 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34:36 3:20 Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 117 days of this bitch. Blessed are you, Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 21 days, which is 3 weeks of the Omer. Merciful One, restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash. Amen. Salah. We're gonna come up with it. Shizzy? Oh, for Shizzy, dog. What is this bullshit? Literally. Pussy ass bitch. Alright, now what are we doing? We're assaulting the masses of memes, baby. Look at these memes. Every single one. 2 views. I think I'm both of them. Really? Oh, shit, dog. This athleticism, though. Look at this move. Dude, no mouse. Oh, no. We're going raw, girl. You're gonna use that little red thing, maybe. Do it. Oh, yeah. Study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Handle on those ideas. Untenable, such notions greatly create are still developing, and there are now serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its complex defense, prophets of ancient Israel, and to the rise of modern customists. Of course, this series is exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to accentuate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly they are obscure. Let me express to congregation via allowing me to reach on Esoterica playlist entering the introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting I'd hope you check out my other content on esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps a donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. But just as a recap from last time, what we handled was at some level Christian Kabbalah and Lurianic Kabbalah. And I always look back on how I handle Lurianic Kabbalah, and there's always a problem with teaching it. And the problem with teaching it goes like this: is that either you go too thin or you go too thick. And I always feel like I go too thin, and then sometimes when I feel like I go too thick on Lurianic Kabbalah, I lose people. Even a very thin overview, I think, loses people really. It requires such a heavy amount of background knowledge of Kabbalah to really get a handle on it. And so there's just no right way of covering it without sort of doing an entire class on it. But the main recap from last time is that by the 15th century, Kabbalah is spreading. It's moving. It's moving not just within the Jewish community, but it's also moving outside the Jewish community. Especially Christians are picking up Kabbalah. They're doing their own kind of Christian Kabbalah. They're taking Kabbalah from their Jewish neighbors. They're hiring converted Jews to translate texts for them, folks like Resius and Flavius Mithridates. And so Christian Kabbalah becomes a part of this larger Renaissance movement of trying to mine older traditions for these perennial truths. In that process of mining those older traditions for perennial truths, it's going to build up a philosophy that sometimes gets referred to as esotericism or Christian mysticism, specifically in the occult mode. And this form of Christian Kabbalah is going to eventually become a whole thing to itself. The Christians are going to kind of run with Kabbalah, they're going to adopt ideas from it, and eventually what's going to emerge is kind of what's sometimes referred to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is a form of Kabbalah that mixes occult ideas and Christian mysticism ideas and Jewish ideas into one synthetic thing. And this was the groundwork for what is now called Western esotericism. So, in many ways, Kabbalah gets a life of its own in the Christian world and completely indifferent. Of course, the big form of Kabbalah that develops at this time is the Lurianic Kabbalah. And just to, as a refresher back over to what we covered last in a couple of weeks, we're in the way. But the big ideas in Luria is that Luria is really, really focused in the he's very concerned how it is that God comes to be all of reality. This is a very pantheistic or panentheistic, whatever shade of flavor of that you want to go with. But he's really concerned with the descent of the universe, how the universe comes into being, and he develops. Cordovera helped develop before him, but the idea of the 4 or 5 worlds, depending on how you want to count them. Then you have these various levels of reality, and what ends up happening is that at every level of reality, there are more spheroids. We get more and more. Here with the house, I can show you a book I have called the Ilan Hagadol, which is a kind of a map of reality according to the classic take, where you have an enormously complicated system of spherod within spherod. If you want to see this book, I'll show you, but it comes incredibly Byzantine. System.
I want to see that bitch.
Very Baroque, I suppose you could say. Void, sunlight, which shatters best inside. This leads to a kind of cosmic tragedy. Tragic tikkun. The process of tikkun is accomplished by Jews basically maintaining the Torah, Jews maintaining strict observance to Jewish law, and by that strict observance of Jewish law, the metaphysical realities, various realities, are repaired. They undergo tikkun olam, and that paves the way for the Messiah. So the messianic idea is going to be a big deal tonight. The messianic idea in Kabbalah begins to really heavily alter during the period of Lurianic Kabbalah, And it becomes less the idea that God has picked someone to become the Messiah and is sort of thrown into history as the Messiah, and is sort of made Messiah before all time, sort of like Jesus is. Rather, Messiah is something that you can become, that you can become Messiah by becoming sufficiently righteous or sufficiently metaphysically able to manipulate reality in the interest of this tikkun process. And so you have a lot of ideas of exile and redemption in Lurianic Kabbalah that become very important just a bit. And so what's going on in Lurianic Kabbalah is a radical renovation and systemization of Kabbalah as in inherited through the past several hundred years. Remember that the Sefer Zohar was only basically written down or published beginning in the 1270s, and that we're now in the 16th century, and it's in the 16th century that Lurianic Kabbalah will come about. So it's been about 300 years since the development of the Kabbalah, and so 300 years is quite a long time, and it's in this 300-year period that the Kabbalah really undergoes its major systemization. Also, its major systems theory, and theory is the one. Now, again, I drive this point home. It's Lurie did not leave us a system. He left us a bunch of teachings to a bunch of students, and those students don't even agree about exactly what his teachings were. Chaim Vital, his most famous student, leaves us one system of teachings. His earlier student, Israel Saruk, who doesn't really get any private reason, but he published another system first. It's very what is the called? Lurie didn't write much down. He did write down mostly just poetry. But we actually don't have Luria's teaching. We have his students repeating his teachings many, many years later. And so the game of telephone, that's a good question. And we actually don't know. In fact, even the main topic is a teaching that went on to become Lurianic Kabbalah, a book time by Chaim Vital. That was not even intended to try it. And it was actually illicitly kind of stolen him and then his consent. It's not even clear that that was even meant to be a systematic representation of Luria's teaching. So it's a mess. It's just a mess. And so Kabbalah is the definitive Kabbalah. Go to the Kabbalah Center and you learn the Kabbalah. You learn this definitive. That's completely not possible. The Kabbalah is a mess. From an academic point of view, at least, and as you study it, you realize that there are lots of different systems out there in the historical record, and they don't really agree with each other. They don't really agree at all. Tzimtzum is a big problem. It's exactly how the Tzimtzum happens. It's when God tzimtzums, everything come out into the vacuum, everything pulled out of the void, or there's stuff left behind. There is stuff left behind. What's left behind? It's just a bit of a mess. Into it. What I want to say is two things, things. One thing is I'm going to be talking a little differently than what the slides are saying. So if you have information on the slides than what I say, so that's one thing that will be importantly different about this talk than other talks. And the reason why that is the information that I want to get out about Shabbat TV, and that I can only put it in the slides. If I talked about all of it, we would be here all night. So there's a lot more information on the slides than is on that I'll be talking about. But I want to make sure the slides are there. So if you want to read the slides as they go, you'll get a lot more information from there. So that's the main thing to know about sort of the general flow. So if you're typically just listening to this as like a podcast style or something, then you'll be missing a lot of information by not looking at the slides. You do you, as the kids say. So tonight we're going to be talking about Messiah. Jude is full of failed messiahs. We have to have Shimon, we have to do this. We have a lot of failed messiahs. The question is, what is Messiah? What is this concept of Mashiach? What does it mean to be Messiah? The idea developed primarily during the Zoroastrian influence period, that is to say during the Persian period under the sort of the reigns of the apocalyptic. And the idea does begin to appear very late in the Tanakh. And it seems to be the idea of a kind of chosen person by God to do some world historical thing. Now, in the Bible, it's not really clear what any of that means. In fact, the only person in the Bible to be referred to as a Messiah is actually a pagan king, King Cyrus. It's a Persian king, not even a Jewish guy. So the idea is that basically God picked Cyrus to do this very important historical thing, i.e. let the Jews return home to Judea, and that becomes grounds for the Bible to refer as a Messiah. He's the only person referred to as a Messiah in the entire Bible. So if you go to the Bible for it, the only person referred to is a Persian king. Now, what ends up happening is that over time, this idea of Messiah evolves and changes. Typically, settled. What's happened in Judaism, I think I mentioned in the previous talk, is that people grab onto a Messiah, they want a person to be the Messiah, and they kind of backtrack their notion of Messiah onto that person. So you pick a person to be Messiah, and then you figure out what that means, and then you go to the Bible to prove that they are the Messiah. There is no ready-made theory of the Messiah out there. It just doesn't exist. Now, we'll talk about some rough and ready ideas that we find in Judaism, but even they're pretty rough and ready. So, over time, what ends up happening is the notion becomes more and more canonical, becomes more and more. And by the Babylonian Talmud, there are special mean. What is to be even by then, by the 5th century of the era, there's no agreement. So if you read Tractate Sanhedrin towards the very end, the 90s of the Davim, you'll see that there's a lot of debate about even what they thought the Messiah was, what the Messiah is going to do, how you recognize the Messiah, what's the Messiah's name. There's an enormous amount of debate about this. At any rate, by the Middle Ages, belief in the Messiah had become a dominant part of Judaism. In fact, it's one of Maimonides' 12 articles of faith. You're supposed to believe that the Messiah is going to come. You have to fervently believe this. So there's the idea that you can believe in Messiah, but it's still not hammered out what exactly the Messiah is and what they're going to do. And it's not even clear this in a text, which is that even claim that there are going to be two of them going to die. And then one of them will be like a military leader. In fact, almost all the literature overwhelmingly is going to be Messiah as a kind of military leader. Furthermore, there's the idea of Mashiach Lador, which is the notion that in every generation there is a sort of potential Messiah. That the Messiah is actually out there, and it's just a matter of them activating themselves, or getting activated, or God activates them, or somehow they get activated. They have to be made a Messiah active. It's just that more been worthy of that task up till now. So, what little do we know about what the Messiah will do? How do we know a false Messiah? Well, the Messiah, because it's very clear that Jesus has not accomplished that. According to even general lists, this truth is not just of Jesus. The list of things that they are supposed to do are things like they have to be born bloodline, they have to be related by blood to David, you have to trace your lineage back to David. They have to rebuild all the ruined cities of Israel. So every city in Israel that's been ruined over history has to be rebuilt. They have to construct a third temple. That's a thing they have to do. They have to be both king and high priest, and they have to live 1,000 years. Well, one of the main problems with Messiah is they tend to die. Anyone that's lived, above the age of 60. So they tend to die and not live 1,000 years. They have to bring world peace. No big whoop. In fact, not only bring world peace, they have to bring peace to the point not even the animals fight each other anymore. So that it's world peace at the level of not even animals hunt each other anymore. They have to cause every nation in the world to worship the God of Israel, so everybody becomes kind of Jewish. They resurrect and judge the dead, or at least they judge the dead. Maybe don't resurrect them, but they judge them. In fact, they judge them by smell, which is weird. The Messiah said to smell and judge. They can know your sins by smell alone. It's sort of like a sin sommelier. They stop all illness, they stop all death, they stop all sadness, hunger, and strife. They cause all the Jews to immigrate to the newly established Jewish kingdom, which stretches from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, which is sometimes referred to as Greater Israel. They got to do all that. That's the bare minimum. Just to be clear, this is the bare minimum. There are all kinds of other things. Have never done any one of these things, much less all of them. Now, according to the Christians, Jesus will come back and do all this stuff later, but, well, they've been waiting for 2,000 years, and this guy hasn't showed back up. So, at any rate, these are the sort of the general outlines of what we think of when we think of Messiah in Jewish theology. Of course, it's much more complicated than this, but typically, these are the bare bones things that make a Messiah. Now, when we go back in time to the 17th century, when we go back in time to the world that's going to produce this false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, there's a couple different things that are going to be important about the historical elements. So I want to go through those relatively briefly. The first thing that's really important about the Jewish world is that rational philosophy has lost the fight to Kabbalah. Kabbalah has won. There is no more Maimonideanism. Not really. There's not much in the way of rationalistic Judaism. Rationalistic Judaism has kind of gone out the window. And what's increasingly taken over at this point is a turn toward Kabbalah. Now, it's not to say that Kabbalah has spread very far and wide, but it certainly is the dominant intellectual movement of the time. Most of the intellectuals are either going straight into legal stuff via the Talmud, or they are doing that. Philosophy, for the most part, is just not a big part of the equation anymore. And so in some ways, it may just be an unchecked kind of enthusiasm around Kabbalah. The second thing that makes all this very important is the Alhambra Decree. Of course, the Alhambra Decree was a complete disaster for the Sephardic Jewish world, where all the Jews were basically ejected from Spain, Portugal as well. And this ejection did two things. One, it heightened Messianic expectations. People really thought that this was the end of the world, because it was the end of their world. And the idea was that because it was the end of their world, perhaps God would intervene and save them. But how could God just let all these hundreds of thousands of people be kicked out of their homelands in Spain? God would intervene and fix it. Well, God didn't fix it, because that typically doesn't happen. What ends up happening is that people end up converting. They converted in mass, probably about the hundreds of thousands. They converted to Christianity. And what ended up happening is that they converted to Christianity and then eventually left and began to be Jewish again. Now, what ends up happening in some of these things that's really important is a couple of things that I want to go through relatively brief here. The first is an intense feeling of exile. They are experiencing exile in a deep land like Spain are destined. They really earned, and a big part of this is mapped in Florian and Kabbalah more generally, the kind of exile restoration motif. Secondly, there's just sort of an apocalyptic flair in Europe generally. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But in the 1600s and the 17th century, apocalypticism, the idea the world was about to end, was just an overwhelming cultural aspect of what was going on in Europe at the time, both Christians and Jews. One of the things that's also important about this is a shift in converso communities, because they were more in contact with Christianity. They had been practicing Christianity and learning Christianity for quite some time now. It's a generation. Their concept of Messiah was much more open to the idea of a spiritual Messiah, or a Messiah that didn't do all the political stuff. Now, the political aspect of the Messiah is essential to the notion of Messiah in Judaism. There's just no thing as a spiritual Messiah. Always a king, concrete, this manner. Well, the Christian idea of Messiah isn't that. The Messiah did not. Messiah meant they were more open to non-traditional ideas of Messiah more generally. This is they were also open to the idea that of what we might call theological supersessionism, which is just to say that having been raised as Christians, they were told the idea that Judaism had been superseded by Christianity. Christianity had come along and corrected all the errors of Judaism, and that Christianity was the superseding, corrected religion, and that Judaism was. What's important about that is the idea that Judaism, in some ways, could be replaced. So they're going to convert back to Judaism. They're going to revert back to Judaism. They're going to be much more open to the idea that fundamental things about Judaism can be changed. Traditional Jewish communities would not be open to that idea, but many of these converso communities and many of these converso people would be open to it. And also, they're going to be much more open to what we call antinomianism, which is just to say that for a traditional Jewish community, observance of Jewish law, observance of the Sabbath, observance of kashrut, observance of certain aspects of Jewish law are just not questionable. They're not up for grabs. We're not living in the Reconstructionist world of the 21st century. The traditional Jewish world is very clear. You cannot abandon any aspect of Judaism. You can't negotiate with it. You have to do it or not do it. It's not up for grabs. But for these converso communities, there's much more of the idea that you could violate the law, but the law is not immutable. That the law is something that can be read as a metaphor, or it can be read as a way that can be changed. That one could alter Jewish law in the interest of spiritual or somehow higher notions. An idea that's completely foreign to traditional Jewish ideas, but very much in the strain of folks who have been exposed to Christianity. Further, the situation in Europe is just such that, in general, people expected a kind of apocalypse. That was just in the air. Christians, Jews, Muslims, basically everybody thought the world was about to end. And a very, very intense comets started appearing, all kinds of weird stuff was happening. People were really convinced the world was about to end. Further, we also have printing that's taken off. Now, printing is one of these things that disseminates ideas very, very rapidly. And that's one of the things about printing.
Hello, I'm listening to a podcast. Feel free to listen.
Also disseminate ideas that are incorrect very rapidly. And what you get are all these bizarre
podcast are you listening to?
being printed through your
I'm busy right now. We can talk in like an hour.
that one good example of this. One good example of this is that all the
Okay,
Jews that
you can drop in now?
10 lost tribes,
No, come back in an hour and I'll talk.
They had returned in Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. They
Okay.
returned to Arabia. They had amassed a giant army led by this general, and that the 10 tribes of Israel had overtaken Mecca and had destroyed Mecca. They had conquered Islam. This idea is completely nuts. It's not grounded in any history at all. But there were repeated broadsheets printed through Europe where people really did believe that the 10 tribes of Europe were literally about to reconquer Israel and bring about into the world. This was a very common idea. So these kind of authors were very popular. Not just that, but there's all kinds of things going on in Europe that led the world to undergo some big change. Columbus's discovery of the so-called New World. They were the ongoing religious world. Wars, the 100 Years' War, the Protestant Reformation. There's tons of tolerance. There's the witch trials. There are all kinds of things going on. If you want to get an idea about this time period, right, I'm sure most folks have heard of Michel de Nostradamus, right? The Nostradamus is famous for his quatrains, his prophetic quatrains. He dies in 1566. It's around it's sort of roughly the time. So what's going on here is that the entire world is expecting a kind of messianic or apocalyptic event. And so, in some ways, had it not been Shabbatai Tzvi, it'd have been somebody else. I really am convinced of that. It just happened to be Shabbatai Tzvi. Also, there's a huge massacre in Poland that kills thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. In fact, the Kaminsky pogrom or Kaminsky uprising may have been the largest single killing of Jews prior to the Holocaust, which also occurred in Poland. And there was massive killing, maybe up to even 100,000. We're not sure how many died, but it was probably the largest mass killing of Jews up until the Holocaust. And also, again, we have this messianic expectation of of this giant massacre. And it's into that situation that we meet Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai's born into a mercantile family on Tisha B'Av on Shabbat. That's why he's called Shabbatai. It's not uncommon for it wasn't then at least for people born on Shabbat to be named Shabbatai. Their kids Shabbatai anymore because of how bad Shabbatai Tzvi's reputation has become. But he's also born on Tisha B'Av. You may know this, that on Tisha B'Av it's a custom in ViralRabbi, Midrash, that the Messiah is going to be born on Tisha B'Av. As you probably know, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's the day of mourning. It's when all these bad things happen. Temples destroyed, and World War I started, and all kinds of bad things. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising crushed. All kinds of bad things happen on Tisha B'Av. It's a day of mourning. Well, the idea from ViralRabbi is that the Messiah will be born on Tisha B'Av, convert the thing into a Holy High being born on just the right day, and not just being born on Tisha B'Av, but also being born on Shabbat. And this is already an auspicious start here in 1626 in Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, as you may know, is the site of ancient Ephesus. So I've been to Izmir, but yeah, it's the site of ancient Ephesus. By this, as Shabbatai is growing a little older, he begins to engage in some strange practices already. He involved in the mercantile practices of his family. He begins to turn his attention to ascetic practices, and he begins to drown himself, I would say, in reading the Sefer Zohar and the Sefer HaKadosh, where a student questions a teacher about the various laws, and the teacher tells the student why we do the laws the way that we do. The idea of questioning the law is going to be a big part of Shabbatai's life, as we'll see in just a bit. Also, it's around this time, teen, that has this vision or the experience of his penis being damaged by a demon happen, but sexual issues will plague Shabbatai his entire life. And so the idea of being or better of Noah's wife, actually. But this demoness Na'amah, who we find in the Zohar, is said to have done something to Shabbatai's penis, causes him all kinds of problems. Experience these periods he calls illumination and darkness. Periods of illumination is singing and dancing and doing all kinds of strange behaviors. And these will last for weeks, and then he will be plunged into darkness where he thinks he will be dead. He's sure every worst, and I think it's terrible. So, probably suffering. Most psychologists I've talked to diagnose him after his death, of course, as something like manic depression. But he also, at the same time, he now began to claim that he could do supernatural things like levitate. In fact, he claimed to levitate in front of several of his friends. His friends said that he really didn't levitate, and then he told them that he just didn't deserve to see him, but they weren't righteous enough, they weren't pure enough. But he really did levitate, according to Shabbatai. His family tries to fix him by marrying him off, which is the common solution for things back in the day. Just get married and things will get better. Shabbatai refused to consummate either marriage. He basically would not have sex with these women. And these women complained that Shabbatai was basically just studying the Zohar all the time. These illuminations and darkness fits. He wouldn't have sex with them, and his marriages were dissolved. And of course, as you imagine, this is a huge problem for his family. It's a huge embarrassment for his family. They divorced, and so he's twice divorced by summer of 1648. And on June 11th, 38, he had a vision of Prophet Elijah coming to him and telling him that he is the Messiah, basically anointing him and making him into the Messiah. And we're told that he began to exude fragrance from his body. So this is the thing that's commonly talked about Shabbatai Tzvi, is that he smelled really good. He had this intense fragrance coming off his body. And so he told some of his close friends and his family that he was the Messiah. I don't know how they responded to this, but because he kept it pretty secret. In the aftermath of him thinking he was the Messiah, even though secretly by 1651, Shabbatai is kicked out of Israel. He is exiled from his homeland. He's kicked out. He's exiled for reasons that aren't terribly clear exactly. But one of the things that we do know that he was doing at this time was that during prayers he was enunciating the divine name of God during prayer. This is a no-no in Judaism. You're not allowed to say God's name, and Shabbatai was doing this in prayer, along with some other strange things he was up to, and this led to him being kicked out of the community. He'll come back with the vengeance. Hearing that he's Roman, you guys believe in Shabbatai speak. The period, but we know he traveled all around Egypt and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean basin, and he did some strange things. He would settle in the really heavily Kabbalistic city of Salonika, and what is now Greece, and there he publicly married a Torah scroll. That also was not a thing you should do. That got him kicked out of Salonika. He seemed to have made a pretty strong impression on people as he traveled. Now, making a strong impression is not making a good impression, and so he often made a bad impression on people because they thought he was crazy, or maybe he was a prophet or a Kabbalist or whatever. But he made an impression on people no matter where he went, and eventually he settled in Cairo, where he comes into the family of a very wealthy leader of the Jewish community. And it's there that Shabbatai actually had a job being basically a fundraiser. What he would do is he would go to Jerusalem and he would raise money for the community there. The community in Jerusalem was notoriously poor. And what he would do is he would go back and forth raising money from local folks trying to get the Jerusalem community back online. He was actually on one of these missions of fundraising back in Cairo that an orphan from the massacres that I mentioned in Poland earlier actually had arrived in Cairo, and she was a piece of work herself. She was a pretty famous sex worker, and she was a former orphan that had been orphaned by the massacres in Poland, and she had traveled all the way through places like Livorno and Amsterdam, where she eventually made her way to Cairo, and she made her name as a pretty famous sex worker, something like not exactly a courtesan, famous sex worker. And when Shabbatai was in Cairo, he actually heard about her reputation, and one of the things that she claimed was that she would marry the Messiah. That was her big claim to fame, is that she would marry the Messiah, and Shabbatai, already having ideas that he was in fact the Messiah, took this sign, sent for her. I think she was in Livorno at the time. He sent for her, and she came to Cairo, and he married her in the house of this really famous Jewish leader in Cairo. And he did this probably as part of his messianic buildup, because as you may know, the prophet Hosea also married a sex worker as a sign of his prophecy, that he was acting out his prophecy by marrying this sex worker. And what's interesting is that Sarah basically remained loyal to him until she died. She was with him all the way in his very tumultuous life. She died in 1674, and they were divorced briefly, but they were together for basically their entire adult life. And so they lived there for about a year until Shabbatai eventually made his way back to Jerusalem. But on the way to Jerusalem, he stops in Gaza. He stops in Gaza because he wants to meet a young and up-and-coming Kabbalist. That young and up-and-coming Kabbalist is a 23-year-old Elisha Chaim Levi Ashkenazi. Nathan of Gaza is probably one of the leading Kabbalist, up-and-coming Kabbalist mind. He understands not just but he also even knows debates that are going on inside of Kabbalah, that there are specific blocks, and Nate Gaza is actually wading into the waters of being really technical around the nature of Kabbalah as it's being developed. Now, what had happening is, and he's having visions. He begins to have visions as a young man, and these visions are such that becomes kind of a mystical healer. Now, the idea of a mystical healer isn't completely foreign to Judaism. We actually see the same idea, for instance, like with physicians, the soul, as I sometimes refer to. And there's the idea that people like Luria and Nathan of Gaza can cure spiritual diseases that you have by diagnosing those spiritual diseases and by giving you a tikkun or a cure, a reparation, and that cure will fix your spiritual illness. It will solve your spiritual problems. And so it seems like the Shabbatai Tzvi actually travels to Gaza to meet with Nathan, and to basically become cured of his what we might call manic depression, cycles of illumination and darkness. Well, what ends up happening is that he ends up traveling to Gaza. He stays with Nathan for several weeks, and in on these very long epic walks, they walk from Jerusalem to Hebron, and it's in those walks that eventually Nathan tells Shabbatai that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He lays it on Shabbatai. He's like, not only can I not cure you, but you don't need to be cured, you're the Messiah. And Shabbatai says, look, I know that I'm the Messiah. I gave it up. I knew that I could be the Messiah, but I gave it up. He seems to be in one of his dark periods in this whole business. What ends up happening eventually is that Nathan eventually announces the entire Shabbatai is the Messiah business in near Shavuot 1665, and Nathan is possessed by this Magid spirit. This is all incredibly weird. And eventually, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai is experiencing a profound one of these depression periods, and then 3 days later, he declares that he is in fact the Messiah. Now, again, people declaring that people are the Messiah is nothing new in Judaism. People, every once in a while, come along and say they're the Messiah. And what typically happens is that no one believes them, or very few people believe them, and they get themselves killed. That's typically what ends up happening. Well, what ends up happening with Shabbatai is absolutely shocking. In Gaza, he declares he's the Messiah, and he announces that the fast of the 17th Tammuz is to be abolished, and he abolishes it. He does not observe the fast, and rather than observe the fast, he announces that that Hallel should be said. Hallel is what you say for praise, what you say in Sukkot for praise. And so rather than engage in the fast of Tammuz, he declares that he has abolished it, that the days of Messiah are here, the days of fasting are over, we can now all celebrate. And he takes, at this point, he has about 40 followers, takes them from Gaza to Jerusalem, and he declares himself the Messiah in Jerusalem. He says, I am the Messiah. He tries to get on top of the Temple Mount to perform a sacrifice, basically, to try to inaugurate the reality of the third temple. He also begins to refer to himself as the Amirah, Adonenu Malkeinu Yarum Hodo. And the Jerusalem community stops him. They're like, you're nuts, you're crazy. Temple Mount, there's a mosque up there. If you go up there where there's a mosque up there and try to kill an animal, you're gonna get in trouble. You're gonna get us all in trouble. So the local rabbis actually turn him over to the local Qadi. The Qadi is basically the mayor of Jerusalem, the Turkish mayor of Jerusalem, and they turn him over to the Qadi, and they say, this guy's crazy, we need to arrest him. The Qadi arrests him. What does arrest him? He allows Shabbatai to go around on horseback, around the city, waving a green banner. Now, riding around on a horse doesn't seem like a big deal, except for Jews weren't allowed to ride on horses. It was against Muslim Islamic law for Jews to ride on horses. That was exclusively the purview of Muslims. But for whatever reason, the Qadi of Jerusalem, just probably because he thinks this guy's crazy, lets him ride around, circle around Jerusalem, waving this green banner 7 times. And this is proof for Shabbatai's followers that he's actually important. He's actually the Messiah. Because he is able to basically not get arrested by the local Qadi, and he is able to the city on horseback 7 times. So some Jericho imagery. Further, he allows his followers to eat forbidden food, certain parts of the animal, which the Bible declares to be unkosher. He says to his followers they're allowed to do. He allows them to engage in violations of Jewish law. These violations of Jewish law, he even has a special blessing for violating Jewish law on purpose. And eventually, rabbis at Jerusalem send a complaint against him all the way to the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. Well, what ends up happening, Shammai is run out of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem community, which previously liked him, at least to some degree. They said they liked him, a good singer and very charismatic. They run him out of Jerusalem, and what ends up happening is Shabbatai departs for Aleppo, now modern Syria. And what happens there is that Nathan's already sent letters ahead of Shabbatai to the folks at Aleppo, specifically letters explaining, using very complex Kabbalistic justifications, things like the treatise of the dragons and other kinds of documents, that Shabbatai is in fact the Messiah and that they need to welcome him as the Messiah. Well, it's not clear exactly how and why the folks at Aleppo were so supportive that the letters that Nathan of Gaza wrote, and he is welcomed into the Messiah. He stays there for about 3 weeks, and it is a complete wave of enthusiasm. There are people prophesying in the streets that the Messiah has come. He basically converts much of the crowd of Aleppo, most of the Jewish community of Aleppo, to him. He basically converts them to Messianism. And he gets perhaps one of his most important allies at this time. That important ally is the son of Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital, his son, remember Chaim Vital is one of the main people responsible for the Messiah, or for the Kabbalah. He's been dead now in Aleppo, and his son. So it's like having the son of the most important Kabbalist of all time, basically, to this guy's side. It is a huge explosion and enthusiasm that he received in Aleppo. After spending 22 days in Aleppo, Nathan is still back in Gaza, feverishly writing letters, feverishly writing these tracts, and prayer books, and prophecy. He's sending these all over the Jewish world. You know, you could not ask for a better PR man than Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan is sending this stuff everywhere. Everybody's getting it. People are getting very excited about the things that Shabbatai can do, allegedly. And what ends up happening is that Shabbatai makes his way back home to Izmir. Gets there, well, he falls into a depression. He's in a depression for weeks, and it's not until Hanukkah of that year that he emerges from the depression. And it's around this time that the local rabbi gets the writ of excommunication, basically, gets what will become the writ of excommunication from Istanbul. And in sometime around Hanukkah of that year, there is an explosion of tension. There are the pro-Shabbatai people and the anti-Shabbatai people. And what ends up happening is the prayers on the Sabbath, and literally Shabbatai grabs an axe and hacks his way on the Sabbath into the Portuguese synagogue, and then chases the other rabbi out of the building. He says he cleansed it of the klipot, of the evil forces that were inside the synagogue, and then he sets himself up as kind of a king inside the Portuguese synagogue after chasing the other rabbi out with an axe. Not only got chased out in his own town, Rabbi's daughters fall into prophetic fits, declaring Shabbatai. So this guy's getting it from all sides. He's being chased around by Shabbatai with an axe, and his own daughters are falling into these enthusiastic trances, declaring that Shabbatai is the Messiah. All kinds of Christian songs. He allows women to come to the Bima to read the Torah. There are just all kinds of things he begins to do when he's back in Izmir that are rapidly raising the ire of the larger Jewish community. During this time, also that he consummates his marriage with his wife. Apparently, he had, and she shows the bloody cloth, to prove that the marriage had been consummated, to great fanfare. And so, all kinds of things happen here at Izmir that are slowly earning the attention of the wider world. This guy Shabtai is really, really beginning to act out in very, very strange ways. So on December 30th, the end of the year, he set sails with some of his followers to Istanbul. Now, what's happened by the time he set sails, by the 30th of December, Nathan of Gaza's letters have reached everywhere, as far afield as he can heard about Shabbatai Tzvi by the time he set sail, and by the time he arrives in Istanbul in early 1666. He's famous even before he reaches Istanbul. And so everybody's heard about Shabbatai Tzvi. Everybody thinks he's a Messiah. 66. The estimates range population side, with places like the Amsterdam community, largely a converso community, folks Israel, because they were convinced that Shabbatai was literally about to take over the entire world. So that entire community, many people in that community packed their bags, had them on the dock, and were waiting to go home back to Israel because Shabbat done the whole thing. So this was a overwhelming part of the Jewish community, at least half, maybe more. Even Spinoza weighed in about the Shabbatai Tzvi stuff. Spinoza knew about it, but sadly we don't have Spinoza's letter, so we don't know exactly what he believed was going on. Well, the trip from Izmir to Istanbul should only have taken a couple of weeks, but it took 39 days. They had very, very bad weather, and what ends up happening is that Shabbatai, the news of Shabbatai coming to Istanbul gets ahead of him, and because it gets ahead of him, as soon as he arrives in Istanbul, he's arrested. The Turkish government knows what this guy is. They know what he's coming there to do. He's coming in Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and the idea is going to take over the Ottoman Empire. He's going to take the whole thing over as the king of the Ottoman Empire. So he's arrested. He's even beaten up by one of the guards, and he's thrown in jail. The jail he's thrown into a tower of strength, and he's put into captivity, but he's put into very luxurious captivity. His followers, which at this point amass probably in the thousands, are sending enormous amounts of money to him. So that allows him to basically bribe his guards, and he lives in. He's kind of living like a king inside of this prison, basically. And it's inside this prison that he sees emissaries from Yemen, from Europe, from all over. And it's in this prison situation in the Migdal Oz that he begins to basically hold court as if he were a king. He's dressed like a king, acts like a king, and he is doing all kinds of things while he is imprisoned here in the 1666. And he's receiving, like I said, emissaries from all over who believe that despite the fact that he's in prison, it's only a matter of time until he reveals that he really is the Messiah. So he's receiving emissaries from all over, and they are coming back and really preach the book of Shabbatai Tzvi. And it's at this time in 1666 that the Shabbatian movement was at its peak, although it's only been really operating now for about 2 years. What ends up happening is that a hater basically ruins everything for him. This guy named Nehemiah Cohen arrives from Gallipoli, and he's heard about that Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah. He meets with them, and basically he becomes disillusioned. He thinks this guy's really not the Messiah. This guy's just a charlatan. He's not really the Messiah. Probably because Nehemiah Cohen thought he was the Messiah beef. And he tells the Sultan, basically, or at least the emissary of the Sultan, that this guy is a danger. He is living in the lap of luxury. He's engaging in all kinds of debaucherous activity. And what's happening is that on September 15th, 1666, Shabbatai is arrested, re-arrested, drug in to see the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, and he's basically told, a very simple thing. He says, look, here's the skinning. They interrogate him. Here's your CSI. Right? Here's the test. If you pass one test, and the test is this: we're going to strip you naked. We're going to bring in a bunch of archers, and they're going to shoot you with arrows. And if you survive, if the arrows bounce off of you, we'll all convert. And if not, well, you'll die. And they say, all right, Shabbatai, if you're the Messiah, right, let's do this. And so Shabbatai very promptly says, nope, I'm not the Messiah, I'm just a rabbi. He does not want to be shot with a bunch of arrows. And so the vizier of the Ottoman Empire says, okay, Shabbatai, well, you have one option now. You can convert to Islam or you'll be impaled. Today, you have 5 minutes inside. You convert to Islam or you will be impaled. And Shabbatai, not being stupid, though he might have been crazy, converts. He converts. He concedes them. And he converts on September 1666. And not only does he get pretty converted, position as a gatekeeper, basically, and as he becomes a ceremonial gatekeeper, he's actually an official member of and he gives him a really nice fur coat, and he has basically the most cushy job ever. These gatekeepers were basically just cushy positions given to members of the court, and Shabbatai could do basically whatever he wanted. So in many ways, he came out all the better, at least materially. I mean, obviously, being shot through with arrows would have been really bad. Really bad. The vizier and the son really aren't out to get him. They basically just want him to go away as a problem, and so they give him the cushiest job they can, and basically hopefully he will just quit. Well, the scientists will quit because they're crazy, and because they're crazy and never quit, they're going to get themselves in more and more trouble. And Shabbatai's very lucky that he was not just shot through with arrows. I think had he not had a lot of wealth, I think we'd have had one shish kebab Messiah on our hands. But he had a lot of wealthy friends, and he doesn't end up with shish kebab. So the first thing that happens is apostasy spreads all throughout the Jewish world. And this is really bad. This is really bad. Half the Jewish world thought the guy was the Messiah. They had packed their bags. They were already including Shabbatai Tzvi in their prayers to include Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah. People were really convinced that this guy was going to basically overtake the Ottoman Empire and the world was going to come to an end. They had packed their bags. They were literally on the docks and waiting for news. And the news was like, yeah, he apostatized. He's not Jewish. He converted to Islam. Bad. Not only is it bad, it's embarrassing. All Christians just took it as the Jews were full of it. It was completely crazy Jewish people, stupid Jewish people, can't understand anything. And not only that, the Jews who remained anti-Messiah, folks like Manasseh in Israel and Amsterdam, they were able to greatly close messiness faction. So this was a disaster, a type. And it was a intellectual disaster in history. Like, during apostasy until summer of 1667, actually, he left Gaza and fled to. He ran over to where you get basically Shabbatai. And the big debate this time somehow. Who knows how that's supposed to work? The third reason was that he converted as part of a Kabbalah to redeem the deepest, darkest levels of demonic power that we pose. And the reason he converted was to descend into the Muslims and bring them as part of the Kabbalah. So his apostasy wasn't really apostasy, it was a suffering servant. By plunging himself into the boat, he would be able to somehow engage in a greater act of. The fourth theory about what happened was that he had not really converted, but that the real had gone into heaven, and that what was left behind was a kind of illusion Shabbat somewhere else, going into the eternal realms as part of grand act of redemption, and that the Shabbatai that had converted was a kind of illusion or a kind of shadow or something. So, Shabbatai related about what happened when Shabbatai converted. It seems like Nathan of Bauer version of 3 and 4, except certainly except 3. And his position was, yes, Shabbatai converted to Islam, but this was a temporary, that he would eventually redeem Islam, redeem the Muslims, and that he would emerge out of Islam back to Judaism. And he would emerge as having redeemed just to become an apostate, and he fell into it. And, in fact, he wrote to his brother Elijah and said, "Hey, leave me alone. I'm a Turk now. I don't want to deal with you. I'm done." He plunged into depression and never gave it up. And so, not only does the Shabbatian movement not die in the aftermath of the Sixth Conversion, but like Nathan of Gaza, working of the myth to flourish. To flourish. They calcified. What's the time? Okay. So we can share. So we'll finish Shabbatites tonight. We'll do the Frankists next time, and then I'll also give us a transition perhaps into Hasidism. I'm sure my Hasidic people would absolutely, if they are connected in a way. Great. She's Jewish under the cover of quickly living as a Muslim. And people continue to come to visit him believing he's the Messiah. this this business of raising the code of raising his active. Also, the Muslim leaders still that rabbis of Istanbul, chief rabbis of Istanbul, are exhausted with as a kind of quasi-messiah, and on the 1772, the Pasha, this guy's not really a Muslim. Yeah, he's converted, but he's living as an apostate. He's not living as a Muslim. And this charge is taken very seriously. In 1673, he's exiled to what is now Montenegro. Basically, exiled to get away from all the Jews. Further exile that his wife Sarah died. He would take another wife, Aisha, and he would die alone. Montenegro visited him. His brother, people, he asked, "Are you going to hold on to me?" And he said famously, this is a bit of obscure. He said, "Perhaps you can see that far away." At any rate, on September 7th of 1776, he dies during the Elah of Yom Kippur. He dies at Yom Kippur. He dies as the gates are closing. And his last Jewish Messiah, I suppose, was a prayer book so that you can say the prayers of your work. And we're told that guarding the mountain cave, that when they came back, the cave, the dragon was gone, and that the cave was full of light. Now he is hiding. He has been resurrected. Nathan of Gaza is a PR guy. He continued to believe that Shabbatai was the Messiah all the way up to his death on January 11th, 1680. Many years after Shabbatai died, he continued to write pro-Shabbatian tracts all the way to the that he wasn't dead, that he was hidden, or that he had been ascended into heaven, or transfigured somehow. And eventually in Skopje, in Macedonia, he's trying to live closer to Shabbatai Tzvi. And his grave, actually, until it was destroyed during the Second World War, was an object of veneration. Shabbatians continue. With Shabbatai dead, and dead, bizarre as it is, just petered out with both of these guys dead. 1680, that should be the end of this movement. Well, if you felt that, you'd be dead wrong, because Shabbatianism is about to explode from a few hundred people. It's now a new religion. Shabbatianism is going to form a totally new religion, and that totally new religion is going to be led primarily by Shabbatai. Second wife, Aisha, or Yocheved, she has both names. We'll talk about the religions that are aftermath of Shabbatai Tzvi. Because Shabbatai Tzvi is not just going to die, he's going to continue to live the company all the way until the 1880s. That is when the last Shabbatians that we know of died. Is in the 1880s. In case they survived after that. There were Shabbatians after the 1880s that survived in the Shabbatian world. We think that maybe the Holocaust actually killed the last of the Shabbatians. We don't even know for sure, because part of what is true about them is they don't tell people they're Shabbatians. It's part of their religion to hide their religion. And so, Shabbatai Tzvi, the Shabbatian movement, and the Shabbatians will continue to function in Turkey as called the Donne, all the way up until maybe even now. There may still be Turkey right now. That religion issue is we don't know. Mosby, an 8-part class on Shabbatai Tzvi, and was a Turkish woman, and she took the class at the Federation. She took it because she came from a Shabbatian family. And she, her family, her grandfather had, her parents didn't come from a family that believed in Shabbatai Tzvi. That was part of their family history. And I asked her, are they Shabbat in Turkey? She said that she had not met any. That she knew of families that were Shabbatian families, but she didn't know of anyone practicing Shabbatianism any longer. So many scholars think that it's gone extinct, or that it's up in the air. Again, part of how the religion operates is by keeping it secret. So next what we'll do is we'll talk about the second part of all this. How a basically a manic depressive messiah who died, who converted to another religion and died, managed to give rise to a completely new religion. And that religion, Shabbatianism, actually survived, and may even survive up to this day. So we'll talk about that branch off of Kabbalah and how this Kabbalistic stuff has led to the Shabbatai Tzvi movement. And if you've ever heard these rules around, you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40 and married, etc., etc., if you've ever heard those rules only emerged after this whole business of Shabbatai Tzvi, because of how much of a disaster this was in church history. So the Shabbatian moment actually gives those rules. It's actually what's going to pump the brakes on the spread of Kabbalah, because up to this point, Kabbalah was spreading very rapidly, very publicly. After the Shabbatai Tzvi episode, the rabbis are going to pump the brakes, because they're going to say, oh, it's Kabbalah stuff, it's very dangerous, it's this whole disaster. They're going to pump the brakes on it, and it's going to slow the spread of Kabbalah in some ways. Then it's going to give rise to a whole new religion, the religion of the Donne, the religion of the continued belief in the messiahship of Shabbatai Tzvi. So, wrap up Shabbatai Tzvi. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work in providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those things below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
If I